In increasingly diverse and polarized societies, how we teach about religion matters. Universities are not just centers of knowledge production, they are also places where young people learn how to live together in difference. If students are to become productive and responsible citizens of pluralized societies, they need to acquire interfaith skills. Most voices today concur that universities have an important role to play in this. As Ibu Patel asks, if higher education cannot help students to hold competing identities and values in tension in the safe space of the college campus, then how can we expect them to do so in their lives beyond? From this perspective, another urgent question arises. How do we form strong personalities with adequate social skills necessary for living together harmoniously in plural milieus? There are various reasons why such interfaith skills are considered important, but one recurring reason stands out: to overcome misunderstanding and counter intolerance. In this session, I will explore 3 pedagogical approaches to interreligious learning, each offering a different response to the challenge of diversity, polarization, and exclusion. The first model is known as multi-religious learning. It focuses on promoting religious literacy. The second is the hermeneutic approach to interfaith learning, which centers on personal growth and interreligious maturity. The third introduces a social justice approach, emphasizing structural inequality and power dynamics within the interreligious classroom. Together, these 3 models allow us to see both the potential and the pitfalls of how we teach about religious diversity. Let's begin with multi-religious learning, which is also known as teaching about religion. This approach rests on the idea that misunderstanding and intolerance are rooted in ignorance, and so the remedy is knowledge. As the Delors report once stated, the best way to avoid the lack of comprehension which leads to hatred and violence is to teach about the history of religions and customs. This means introducing students to the major traditions of the world, their beliefs and practices, their sacred texts and rituals, key figures, moral teachings, as well as historical developments. Such an introduction may rely on comparative handbooks or include experiential learning such as on-site visits to religious communities. The approach is typically from the outside and does not require students to engage personally with the material. As Jacobson describe it, this method involves describing the objective characteristics of a religion's history and development, its doctrines, its institutions, and the practices required of its adherents, all without personal involvement or commitment from the students that are learning. The teacher as well takes on a rather neutral or objective stance, ideally bracketed from their own religious or philosophical assumptions. For some, especially those who value academic neutrality, this may be a welcome feature. It aligns with a more modern or secular understanding of scholarship that emphasizes distance, objectivity, and detachment. And within this framework, religious literacy is seen as a powerful antidote to prejudice. Students become skilled in comparing and evaluating religious traditions, but in a rather dispassionate or analytical way. This approach has clear value, especially in a world where religious passions sometimes run high. Learning to assess religious phenomena without fear or favor is part of being an informed global citizen, one may think. And yet, there are certain criticisms to be made. First, this approach tends to present religions as rather abstract systems rather than lived realities. Even when efforts are made to highlight the internal diversity and contextual development of a tradition, students may still walk away with a textbook understanding of the world religions. Such a textbook understanding of the world religions runs the risk of reinforcing stereotypical understandings of traditions and their adherents. It may also lead students to the rather odd conclusion that a Catholic, say Mia, or a Muslim, say Nora, who does not act according to the prescriptions of her tradition, must be a very atypical Muslim or Catholic, rather than concluding that both Mia and Said have appropriated tradition in their personal life, based in particular historical culturally determined context. Religion does not follow the pattern of a textbook, and religious people certainly do not. They rather live it in a messy, complex, and embodied way. The second problem is that the model of multi-religious learning wrongly assumes that it is possible to attain such a neutral and objective point of view when teaching about religions. And it sidesteps the hermeneutical insight that all human beings are always embodied and embedded, and therefore prejudiced in some way. The real question is not whether we are prejudiced as human beings, but whether we recognize our positionality and engage it critically, especially in the presence of others. Claims to neutrality, when unexamined, risk reinforcing hidden biases and universalizing particular viewpoints. Third, the multi-religious model leaves little space for questions of meaning or more personal engagement. And yet many students actually take courses on religion, not just for information or literacy, but for exploration, personal exploration, spiritual exploration. As Jacobson and Jacobson note, students often enroll in these courses to reflect on their own commitments. They want fairness and objectivity, yes, but also space for questioning. They want to think about religion both from the inside as well as from within. And finally, the multi-religious model seems to echo, at least in part, a broader cultural pattern of avoidance found in many modern liberal societies, where those who believe and practice differently often remain strangers to one another. People may hesitate to cross boundaries, not always out of malice, but just out of uncertainty. They fear saying the wrong thing. They fear offending someone or starting a conflict. They are unsure how to manage. This avoidance, whether rooted in ignorance, discomfort, or lack of skill, actually reinforces separation and boundaries. It cannot be overcome by knowledge alone. What is needed is not just information about the other, but also formation through relationship with the other. Students must be equipped not only to learn about religious traditions, but to engage people of other faiths and non-faiths in the messiness of everyday life, and this with humility, with courage and practical skill. These reflections all point to the need for a hermeneutical turn in teaching religious diversity. And this means shifting towards an approach that emphasizes relationality over detachment and acknowledges positionality instead of claiming neutrality, invites questions of meaning, and cultivates interfaith competences in addition to enhancing religious literacy. One that emphasizes relationality over detachment, acknowledges positionality over neutrality, includes questions of meaning, cultivates interfaith competences along religious literacy. That is the kind of approach we need. So let's turn now to the hermeneutic approach to interreligious learning. If proponents of multi-religious learning seek to overcome the problem of intolerance by strengthening religious literacy, the hermeneutic approach to interfaith learning approaches the issue from a different angle. Drawing on insights from developmental psychology of religion, this approach traces the problem of intolerance back to a more fundamental issue, that of personal immaturity. The key assumption here is that resistance or hostility towards those who believe and practice differently often stems from an inability to deal with ambiguity, complexity, and difference. To address this problem, the hermeneutical model places the person and their maturation at the center of the learning process. The goal is to foster what has been called the integral development of students who concomitantly grow to become strong personalities with adequate social skills necessary for living together harmoniously in plural milieus. Through participation in interfaith learning, students are invited into a process of self-discovery and transformation, and they develop a more complex and enriched understanding of themselves, and in doing so, they become more confident and capable of engaging others. At the heart of this approach is the idea that self-understanding and other understanding are deeply intertwined. Learning across religious traditions does not threaten or dilute one's identity, it strengthens it. By encountering the faith of others, students are pushed to examine their own assumptions that deepen their own commitments. Interreligious learning in this model is therefore not only about information, but it is rather about formation. The development of interfaith maturity includes three main dimensions: cognitive, personal, and interpersonal. And each of these reflects a movement from rigidity to flexibility, from black and white thinking to complex understanding, from avoidance to meaningful engagement. Let's first look at cognitive maturity. Within the field of developmental psychology of religion, researchers like Alpert, for example, and Stripe have long explored how intolerance is shaped not simply by religious belief, but by the way people relate to their beliefs and traditions. And a central insight from this field is that religious people are not automatically more intolerant than non-religious people. What matters is not whether one believes, but rather how one believes. Intolerance in this view is less about religion per se, but more about a certain cognitive rigidity. People who engage the world in literal, binary ways, whether religious or not, they tend to divide reality into black and white, into right and wrong, in-group and out-group. And they often struggle with ambiguity and they resist complexity. Individuals like these, we call them ambiguity intolerant, and they experience plurality not as a richness, but as a threat. And because of this, they may adopt rather exclusivist attitudes and rigid worldviews that leave little room for dialogue or difference. Cognitive interfaith maturity offers an alternative. That is what we are supposed to mature into. It describes a way of engaging religious difference that is more open, nuanced, and flexible. Students who develop this form of maturity learn to recognize the internal diversity of religious traditions. They begin to see that religious identities, they are not fixed, but multifaceted. They're shaped by personal history, cultural context, interpretive practice, and they grow in their ability to tolerate uncertainty and develop hermeneutical flexibility. The ability to switch perspectives, to imagine how others see the world, and to engage in translation work. This isn't about giving up convictions, it's about holding them with humility and curiosity. Personal maturity is a second essential dimension. It starts with the recognition that we are all embodied and embedded beings, shaped by history, culture, language and tradition. There is no such thing as a neutral starting point. We all speak from somewhere. Personal maturity begins with self-reflection, asking who we are, where we come from, and how that shapes the way we experience the world. Students indeed must learn to surface their assumptions and understand how unexamined prejudices can distort their view of the other. This process of critical self-reflection also involves acknowledging that our identities are not fixed. We grow, we change, we learn, And much of what defines us comes from sources we did not choose: our families, our cultures, our inherited traditions. Personal maturity means coming to terms with those unchosen, involuntary dimensions and being willing to revisit our self-understanding in light of what we learn from others. Indeed, often it is precisely in encounter with someone who challenges us or surprises us that we begin to see our own blind spots and biases. Interpersonal maturity is the third and final dimension. Many students have had limited interaction with those who believe or live differently. Even when they affirm the value of interfaith dialogue, they may not feel confident or equipped to engage in it. They may not know how to start a conversation across religious boundaries, or how to respond when tensions and conflicts arise in such a context. That is why interfaith maturity is not just a mindset, but it is a skill set. And like any competence, it is cultivated through practice. It is a knowing how rather than a knowing that. And it requires engagement, not just reflection. It is only by spending time with others, by listening, by speaking from one's own position, and by navigating differences together, that students become interreligiously skilled. So a student who matures interpersonally learns to speak about her own tradition with openness and clarity. She learns to affirm what she finds meaningful in the faith of others, and she becomes sensitive to religious particularities and knows how to collaborate across traditions in a way that is respectful and constructive. She also learns how to address difficult or emotionally charged topics without shutting down, avoiding conflict, or exaggerating difference. And perhaps most importantly, she learns that interfaith dialogue cannot happen at a distance. It requires proximity, vulnerability, and sustained effort. Together, these three dimensions, cognitive, personal, and interpersonal, shape the kind of learning that is needed today. Not learning about religion alone, but learning with others. Not just education for knowledge, but formation for engagement. This is what the hermeneutic approach offers. A vision of interreligious education that meets students where they are and helps them grow into people our plural world needs them to become. The hermeneutic approach to interfaith learning is much more nuanced than the multi-religious learning and has several strengths. It is student-centered, interactive, and meets students where they are, helping them grow cognitively, personally, and interpersonally. It offers a holistic framework that prepares them for pluralistic societies and supports social cohesion. Pedagogically, it creates a level playing field where all students, regardless of belief, have something valuable to contribute. Each brings their own embeddedness and insights to the conversation, and all are challenged to engage in self-critical reflection. As an interreligious educator, I have found this hermeneutical model allows me to reach all students, whether they identify as religious, secular, as pluralist or exclusivist. I can challenge students who believe they are neutral to recognize their own positionality. And I can invite certain pluralists to reflect on their own blind spots and encourage exclusivist students to engage in dialogue without requiring them to abandon their convictions. The approach fosters reciprocity. Students come to realize they need one another to better understand themselves and others. That said, the hermeneutic approach also has certain limitations. One of my main concerns is that it lacks a structural power analysis. It tends to frame dialogue as a meeting between equals in a safe space, where everyone learns to reflect, grow, and mature. But in reality, students do not enter the classroom on equal footing, even if we would want that. Some face more barriers than others. Some identities are more easily accepted than others. Secondly, the hermeneutic approach to interfaith tends to reduce the challenge of intolerance to a personal flaw, rather than see it as a societal problem. And without addressing the political dimensions of exclusion, we risk leaving the status quo untouched. While the hermeneutic approach offers valuable insights into personal growth, it tends to overlook the power dynamics that shape interreligious encounters. A social justice approach builds on the hermeneutic model, but introduces a critical awareness of inequality and privilege. It begins with the recognition that students do not enter the classroom as equals. While all may be different, some are more different than others, and some carry more social privilege. This approach questions the assumption that dialogue unfolds in a neutral space. It asks who feels at home in the classroom, who feels they must explain or justify their presence, who benefits from the norms that govern the space, and who is marginalized by them. By surfacing these questions, educators can better understand how structural inequalities tied to religion, tied to race and identity shape participation in interfaith learning. A key concern with regard to the hermeneutic approach is that intolerance tends to be treated as a personal flaw, a problem of maturation, something to be corrected through development and education. But intolerance is not just a matter of individual immaturity. It is also a structural issue. Discrimination is embedded in our institutions, in our norms and our histories. And without addressing these deeper structures, education risks reinforcing existing hierarchies. Interfaith learning does not take place in a vacuum. It unfolds within specific socio-political contexts that shape how religion is perceived and performed. In many Western academic settings, a secularist ethic prevails, and religion is often treated as a private matter or an outdated worldview, and students who are visibly or devoutly religious sometimes face suspicion or bias. And this particularly affects those from non-Christian traditions, who may be seen as too religious or a little bit out of place. This secularist suspicion coexists, and this is paradoxically, with Christian privilege. Christian holidays structure the academic calendar in Western universities. Christian norms shape what counts as appropriate expression, and students from Christian backgrounds often move through academic spaces without having to explain or adapt their beliefs. Those from minority traditions, by contrast, must learn to navigate a culture that is not designed with them in mind. Furthermore, the ideology of Judeo-Christian values adds another layer to this. While often framed as a gesture of inclusion, this language has frequently been used to mark Muslims as outsiders. Especially since 9/11, Western societies have questioned whether Islam fits within the so-called Western value system. Even in well-intentioned interfaith spaces, Muslims have reported that they feel pressure to present themselves as moderate, as open, as dialogical in order to be accepted. Even the hermeneutic model of interfaith dialogue, which focuses on personal belief, tends to reflect a rather Christian understanding of religion. Traditions that emphasize ritual, authority, or communal practice may not fit easily within this framework. Students may feel pressure to translate their identities into this dominant discourse. And in this way, even well-meaning dialogues can reproduce hierarchies. The inequalities described above are not simply interpersonal. They reflect broader ideological patterns embedded in society. While individuals may embody these patterns, benefiting from them or being marginalized by them, the structures themselves are systemic. That is why interfaith learning must go beyond looking only at personal development. It must also critically examine how societal power imbalances shape who speaks, who listens, and who is heard. And educators need to create space for reflection, not only on mutual beliefs, but also on privilege. And they should ask, who gets to define the terms of conversation? Whose experiences are centered and whose discomfort is prioritized? Incorporating a social justice lens helps interfaith education to become truly transformative. It enables students to see not only themselves and each other's, but also the systems in which they are embedded, and it equips them to challenge inequality, not just in dialogue, but also in society at large. It affirms that learning to live together requires more than mutual understanding. It also requires justice and addressing the problems of inequality and privilege.